Welcome to this 37th episode in my series titled Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. My name's Michael Dewan Herrick, and today my guest is Ben Harris. Hello, Ben. Welcome.
Hello, Michael. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I will say a few words about your background. Ben is in private psychotherapy practice in London, the Channel Islands, and he also works online. Once upon a time, he also studied philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford, and subsequent to that was a corporate analyst and a lawyer, which is a very interesting background, I think, for someone to then wind up being a psychotherapist. Yeah?
Yeah, it might be a little unusual, I suppose.
Yeah, a little bit. A little
Well,
bit.
not a lot of
Um,
not a lot of skills that transfer.
but some perhaps. That would be interesting to explore. What possible skills might I think you
Hmm.
use some analytic skills in your chapter, and let me mention that I came across Ben a few months ago upon reading a book that I have mentioned before on this channel, but it's whoops, Cynical Therapies. Ben wrote a chapter titled "Viewing Critical Social Justice from a Psychotherapeutic Perspective," and that's the content of that chapter is going to be part of what we talk about today, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely.
What I also discovered after Ben and I made contact was that we knew each other before. 10 years ago, in 2014, when I was teaching a module at the Minster Centre on diversity, Ben was a student in that class. And that was once upon a time when a white male heterosexual might dare to offer such a course and create my own curriculum to boot. I don't know if that kind of thing still happens, but
I suspect that it might be less flavor of the month these days. I think it might be difficult for a
yeah.
white man to present a diversity course in that way. And indeed, I think it might be difficult to present it in the way that you presented it, because as I remember your course, it was sort of heterodox and permissive, and it was sort of asking questions and opening ideas up rather than presenting a sort of definitive perspective on this is how you think about diversity, which isn't very diverse, but B does seem to be the way that we've gone in more recent years.
Right.
24, like a
Yeah,
lifetime ago, actually.
really. 10 years is a lifetime, and I'm pleased to hear that you remember the course that way. That was my intention at the time.
Mm.
So, before we get into your chapter, could you share a little bit about your path? You make mention of this in the chapter that once upon a time you held different views. You might have been more aligned with critical social justice once upon a time, and something happened, and
Mm.
you wound up with a different perspective.
I did, yes. Yes, it sort of goes back into the dim and distant past for me, to a sort of earlier version of myself. Yes, one of the things that I find about the moment that we're living through, in all its sort of stupidity and distressing kind of simplicity and viciousness, destructiveness, is that it feels a bit personal in a way for me. Um, because it does remind me of an earlier version of myself.
Mm,
Now, when I was, you know, so two things have happened to me, I suppose. Well, a lot of things have happened to me, but maybe the things that are important that have changed between then and now for me is that I used to be very left wing. I am no longer very left wing. So you could think about that
mm,
in kind of the political domain. Maybe that's on some level that's important. On another level, I think it's less important. The more important thing is that I've moved away from experiencing the world in primarily political terms. So I used to
Hmm.
inhabit the world in quite an ideological way, as I think perhaps has become increasingly fashionable these days. I think it's seen as sophisticated to have a highly sort of rigid, structured, elaborated, ideological, politicized view of existence. Um,
Uh-huh.
and I had that in a time before that was the fashion, at a time when it was sort of a bit geeky, really, I suppose. But that was,
Mm-hmm.
I turned up at university and um, why did I have that? I suppose, as for many people who end up becoming psychotherapists, I think it's pretty common. I had, plenty of my own pain to process,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, and I do think that's a common story for us.
Okay.
Often we end up
Sure.
sort of coming into what we do from an experience of
Right. You make
being.
a comment in your chapter, you quote the quote of the personal is political, and then you flip it over and say the political is personal, and you take that view. Do you think that going through a psychotherapy training program facilitated some of your shift in view?
Yes, it did. So interestingly for me, what I found doing the training at the time I did it, I guess everybody takes what they need, or at least that's the
Mm-hmm.
hope, that everybody can take
Mm-hmm.
what they need from a broad training, from a heterodox training. And I do
Mm-hmm.
think the training I received was pretty rigorous actually. Um, and actually what that training helped me to do was to become less ideological, become more philosophical, perhaps, shall we say,
Mm-hmm.
um, but also to kind of be able to leave the world of the mind more as well, to get away from. I used to be very heady. I used to sort of just inhabit my mind really, and that training helped me get more embodied. It helped me become
Mm-hmm.
more
Mm-hmm.
frivolous and less serious, which I also think
I
is
see. I
an
see.
important skill, actually. An important skill.
Uh-huh. The
Now,
skill of frivolity. I like it.
yeah,
Okay.
well, I think, it's good to be serious where it's needed, but I
Uh-huh.
think perhaps one of the here's what I think. I think one of the problems we have today is that we live in over serious times. Now, part
Yeah.
of it's a function of decay, I think there's warfare, there's high levels of
Mm-hmm.
inflation, there's degrading living standards in the West.
Mm-hmm.
I think largely as a consequence of increased globalization. I think it's economists tend to say with more globalization, you have more inequality within nations as the gap between nations sort of stabilizes. So you get fewer gaps between
Mm-hmm.
more
Right.
equality, more inequality within nations. So I
Uh-huh.
think the West is going through an enormously serious readjustment. I think we're probably going through a permanent reduction in Western living standards, actually, which may be
All
partly
right.
why I think
So there are some grim things that we're contending with. It does seem that comedy is one of the casualties of the so-called woke movement. So,
it does.
uh,
They don't seem to be able to kind of deal with humor. They certainly can't be laughed at. But I mean, ideology, of course, is a serious matter. I mean, it was Althusser, I think, who said that ideology is always used to justify power. It's
mm-hmm.
ideology is used to justify reigning group, and of course
Yes.
that is a kind of a serious matter. And the our woke friends are very interested in power, although they always seem to think that they're crusading against other people's power rather than accruing it themselves, which is an enormous projection, I think. And that's
Yep.
something I might say about our woke friends as well, is that I think there's an awful lot of projection going on in the
Uh-huh.
dynamic. Uh,
Uh-huh.
People take things that are true about
Mm-hmm.
themselves and they make them true only
Uh-huh.
about the other person.
Uh-huh. Okay. I like the way you say our woke friends. That's sweet.
Well, I might be being a bit sarcastic, but again,
Uh,
you know,
all right.
I think we always have to kind of have a bit of levity. We need a bit of levity as well as seriousness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
All right.
to come back to where we started quickly, if I might, Michael, this
Yeah.
whole
Yeah. Yeah.
experience. Um, yeah, I was in a lot of pain when I was younger, and I felt at sea, and I was sort of anxious and depressed, and I don't need to go into the details about why that is. We're not here to kind of do a sort of a rundown on my life, but suffice to say that I was quite lost and quite in pain, and
Uh-huh.
I adopted this sort of ideological way of viewing the world as a salve for that pain.
I see.
Um, I was very overweight. Um, not was not good at building relationships with people, certainly not at building relationships with women. And so I sort of perhaps turned away from the more relational or the kind of the lighter side of life, and sort of
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
this rather austere, politicized, ideological, puritanical leftist view of
Okay.
things.
All right.
And
Okay.
that was a way of making myself feel meaningful,
Uh-huh. Okay.
powerful,
Uh-huh. All right.
having a
I
sense of
understand that.
agency. Mm.
That suggests to me, as I, have just freshly reread your chapter, that the things that you have to say from an existential and a psychotherapeutic or psychoanalytic perspective are not just intellectual. These are things that you may have engaged in or experienced to some degree yourself, as as we all do, because they don't just go away. But
Mm.
yeah, all right. So it comes
Yeah,
out
it's
of
personal.
yeah, yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
all
The thing
right.
about that
Thanks.
as well is that I sort of see so then later on in my life I work in the city for a while, and that I don't get much happier. And the thing really that the thing really that kind of makes my life richer, more textured, more worth living is a personal exploration through the structure, the form of psychotherapy. So
Mm-hmm,
I do that personally to
mm-hmm.
start with. I go and become a client.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Uh-huh.
and that's what led me to go and do the training where we
Yeah,
met.
yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And then I thought, wow, there's this sort of incredibly powerful practice full of contradictions, really. It's a sort of powerful, it's got powerful theory, but it's also kind of embodied. It's a kind of disciplined practice, and yet at the same time, it's also a kind of very open, exploratory kind of
Right,
process.
right.
And what I see is an earlier way of coping that I used to have becoming more popular, kind of surging like a wave over society
Right,
and destroying this thing of value, this
right,
pearl
right.
that I
Yeah,
discovered.
yeah. Okay. So maybe we can launch into your chapter because we're kind of getting a little preview of it, I think, already.
Mm.
Um, you start uh, with your opening paragraph saying you have a confession that you like postmodernism, or you appreciate its valuable insights, and then you make the point that the critical social justice, although it relies on it for its argument to some degree, seems not to apply it to itself. That the insight is that knowledge is contextual and incomplete, or it's partial, and yet it doesn't open itself to the same kind of scrutiny. Uh, and that's what you've been describing, this idea that there's an ideological view and that psychotherapy is being taken over a bit by, or a lot by this. And when you went through the training, as you described, there were competing theories. There were things that were in tension with each other, but they were all part of the mix. They're part of a heterodox, approach. And you kind of synthesize these and take what's useful. And my I've never, in being in the field over 40 years now, have ever until now heard of a theory about how to do therapy that said if you disagree or you question this, you're a bad person
Mm,
and
mm.
it cannot be done. Or, that you have to get dragged through a struggle session in your training or ejected from your training because you've questioned this ideology. So, so you start with saying, okay, well, let's now then do what psychotherapy is good at, which is uh, taking a critical view of things,
Mm.
right? Do you want to
Yes.
comment on all that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's a kind of the way the way you put it, I think, is absolutely right. It's a sort of it's a simplistically but brutally effective mechanism
Mm,
to
mm,
stop people from questioning something.
mm-hmm,
But you know that idea that sort of people don't have ideologies, ideologies have people that
mm,
sort of
right.
suggest
Yeah, yeah.
it sort of fits with that, I think. There's this sort of it inspires the ideology of critical social justice inspires a kind of blind terror that you might be accused of something dreadful if you don't
Mm-hmm,
mind your P's and Q's extremely carefully and you know support the correct P's and the correct Q's.
right.
So you might be racist or sexist or homophobic or transphobic, and but they do like to, the ideology likes to have it its own way, doesn't it? Because apparently we're all these things anyway. We can't escape being racist, sexist, homophobic,
Right.
and yet it is the worst thing in the world to be racist, sexist, and homophobic.
Right.
It is in traditional religion, you can do bad things, but your inherent humanity doesn't have to be defined by the bad things you do or say. You can repent
Uh-huh.
of the
You
good
can
and bad
repent
things you
and
do.
be forgiven and be redeemed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Whereas in this, that doesn't seem to be an option. I think you used the term mea culpa in your chapter,
Mm.
and you talked about how those in the dominant or oppressive group uh, will confess their racism or whatever other ism there is
Mm.
as a way to kind of rid themselves or project out onto the others. It's a kind of a little trick in a sense.
Yes,
Um,
it is a trick because it's a sort of it appears to be sophisticated because you're sort of what it appears to suggest is, oh well, look, I'm a sophisticated, intelligent person. I'm able to examine my own prejudice. Now that looks sophisticated. It is rhetorically sophisticated, politically sophisticated, but as I say in the chapter, it's actually psychologically naive because it obscures the reality. The people who are saying, yes, I am racist, but don't worry, look at those people over there. They're much more racist than me. Look at them. They haven't confessed their sins.
right, right, yeah,
It's a device which operates to, it appears that you're taking responsibility, but actually you are projecting your own sense of guilt and badness out onto the other,
right,
just through a
right,
different method, through a different rhetorical method. You're
right,
bad because you haven't admitted your badness, and now you must be punished for it. You know,
right.
I would say that one of the most important things I do, in many ways, I think those of us drawn towards psychoanalysis are quite pessimistic about human nature in a way, or certainly it appears that way often. But I have an optimism as well, which is I actually do believe that people are capable of changing, and I think we can
Hmm.
change in a direction that we choose to move in, and life's a journey. And I think that it's very important. It's a good thing to consider moral culpability, to consider moral questions, but a true consideration of one's own moral state in the world is something that can only be done by an individual in their own time, in their own way. A forced confessional system of morality
Uh-huh.
but
Uh-huh.
it's done to a timetable by an ideology, by an organization. That, they're the ones who talk about words being violence. That, Michael, is a violence. That's a violence against.
Right, right, right. And when the force in, includes observing what happens to others who don't make such a confession, uh, and the kind of consequences of that,
Mm.
yeah, to what degree is
It's
it
rather
a
Kafkaesque.
genuine, yeah, what?
It's rather Kafkaesque, isn't it? Because
Yeah,
you're expected to show that you are good, you must confess your badness. But
uh,
once you've confessed your badness, then the party, the ideology, it's got something on you. So
right,
then you've got to carry on behaving incredibly well. You've got to carry on being totally in line, a very good
uh-huh,
boy, a very good girl.
yeah,
Because if you
yeah,
start to step outside, the thing that we all are, because apparently we're all sexist. Oh, we're all sexist. All men are misogynistic. Sure, you just have to be in touch with it, pay attention to it. But once you've said that, if you start then disagreeing with the ideology, they can turn to you, they can say, you've already confessed your badness. Now we're going to use it again.
right, right, yeah.
So there's a
Get
kind
in
of,
line, get in
yeah,
line, yeah.
the confession is both a necessity, but also then something that binds you into a kind of mafia-like system where you are kind of forced to carry on agreeing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um, so I think
yeah,
that's one of the most invidious things about this.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
I mean, if you talk about dark triad traits, I mean this ideology has dark triad traits in spades. That's why it's so powerful, of course. But it
uh-huh,
really is extremely Machiavellian and extremely
yeah.
sadistic
Narcissistic and,
and narcissistic.
uh-huh,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Which is not to deny those things in the rest of us, because we've all
Well,
got,
right,
right. But
yeah,
you try not to you try not to weaponize them, make them more.
right. So I am really interested if we can talk about the existential perspective and what that offers us in terms of understanding critical social justice. Um, I mean, that part of your chapter I found very powerful and poetic, even. It was very, very to the point. Uh,
Mm.
yeah,
It's a sort of well, yes, thank you for saying so, because I sort of there is something kind of poetically tragic about existence, isn't there?
yeah.
And I think, if you allow yourself to be in touch with that, then you can be in touch with the kind of the pain and the sorrow of that, but also, I suppose, the necessity of it, the fact that it sort of makes life intelligible or meaningful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
But I suppose, to put it simply, that kind of part of the chapter is about thinking about the kind of the situation in which we all exist. So uh, let's start with an obvious one. I mean, death, right? We're all going to
mm-hmm.
die,
Yeah.
um, and we don't want to think about it. We ignore it. We push it away. Tend to. The culture certainly encourages us to push it away. I think the culture sort of. I do think there's another thing here actually, which is that one of the reasons why I think that kind of the medical profession becomes more and more well regarded, more and more kind of powerful in society, more and more regarded as being that you must listen to doctors, you must listen to medical science. It's at the sort of the heart of the culture. Trust the science, all these kind of ideas.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think that's because we've lost spirituality, we've lost religion. So you have to elevate something else. Because if you don't have spirituality, you don't have religion, death then becomes even more terrifying. So why would you not make your high priests those who promise to sort of prolong your life?
Right.
But we've got this terror. So we've got this cultural terror of death. We don't like to think about death. We ignore it. Lots of people these days don't see dead bodies, right? Um, and
Right.
this stuff is sort of hidden away, and yet it's real. And in the back of our minds, we know it's real. So we know that
Hmm.
death is real. We know that our experience of terror, our terror of death, our terror of degeneration, becoming decrepit, our terror of kind of being injured, being
Hmm.
vulnerable, these things are real.
Right.
And we know that life is hard, and we know that existence has entropy, that it does degrade complex
Right.
organisms, and ultimately
Right.
death is a result of that.
Right.
And
Hmm. Hmm.
if you accept that if you accept that reality, you can kind of process some of those feelings. Although I do sort of agree with Freud that actually in the end we can't really imagine our own deaths, but you can come to some accommodation. You can think that actually it's my finitude that makes life meaningful. Suffering is an inevitable part of life, so I might as well make my suffering meaningful.
Hmm. Hmm.
Partly why I think both you and I are talking about the things we're talking about, because it's not
Right.
popular, people don't like it, but
Hmm.
we're
Hmm.
going to suffer, so we might as well suffer for something meaningful, something we feel is
Right.
meaningful.
Right. And I would add to death as maybe being the fundamental existential reality, just all of the things that are required in order to survive, to live life day to day. You know, we have to eat, we have to make an income, we have to navigate a social world, we get injured, um, we
Absolutely right.
we have dreams and goals that are frustrated or we're disappointed or other people are disappointed in us. I mean, there's just all kinds of stuff that just naturally happens that is part of our suffering. And I think the key idea here, though, that you bring out in your chapter, and one that I've been given a lot of thought to, is that critical social justice, aka woke, tends to implicitly suggest that suffering is unnecessary and it's caused by oppressive systems of power.
Mhm.
And that if we could only think correctly and organize society in a perfect way, somehow we would be out of the loop of all of that suffering, you know, and the very idea that disparity of outcomes for different groups can only be the product of some form of discrimination, that
Mm.
there aren't other things at play. You know, there's nothing that causes problems except, you know, the oppressive class of people.
It's almost like if you had a kind of if you're really into hammers, you just express yourself very poetically, Michael. I'm gonna reduce it down to something much more basic. If
Okay.
you're a massive fan of hammers and you read lots of magazines about hammers and you get Hammer Monthly and you build hammers and everything looks like a nail, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
It really is what we're dealing with is I mean, it's disgracefully stupid, really. The kind of the ideology that we're facing, the ideology that is decaying our profession and
Mm-hmm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
causing social dislocations. It is disgracefully stupid, and there's not a lot of charity in what I'm saying there, but I the more time goes on and the more harm I see it doing, particularly in psychotherapy, which is a profession that I love. You know, it's like we all find things in
Mm-hmm.
life that are deeply meaningful to us. It's helped me personally, and it's I think it's a thing of beauty, and
Uh-huh.
it's a kind of it's being assaulted by sort
Mm-hmm.
of this very simplistic, foolish certainty that only one
Mm-hmm.
thing. But as you correctly point out, suffering is inevitable. The suffering of falling in love with somebody and being rejected. You know,
There you go. Yeah. Yeah.
the suffering of needing to get up in the morning and go and make a living. That actually, the world is not going to give us stuff. That we actually have to go out and find something that the world wants from us, so that
Right.
we can make an exchange, make a bargain. And of
Right.
course, this is all of this is extremely, when you think about it, all of this is extremely intimidating and distressing, and it causes existential anxiety. So if you get told, no, 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 the only reason that bad things happen in the world the only reason that bad things happen to you is because of oppression. What a seductive idea. It's obviously
Hmm.
simplistic and it's obviously wrong, but it's incredibly seductive.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because then you can think, well, if I kind of merge into this sort of union with others who feel the same way with this ideology, somebody somewhere in the hierarchy of this ideology is going to change everything, and then they're going to look. Then I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be looked after.
Right.
And of
Right.
course, we
And
all know from over a century of experience of communism that it doesn't work that way.
well, I wish all of us knew that. Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that I think happens in that is not only maybe somebody will save me someday by changing the world to make it kind to me, but my own hunch that I have a hand in my own suffering, that I've somehow failed myself, I get to overlook. I get to somehow assuage or bury my guilt about that and point my finger outward. Uh,
Isn't that the most painful thing when you've made a mistake, you messed up, something bad's happened, and you're feeling kind of angry and upset or distraught, and you're either a little niggle in the back of your mind, or your
mhm,
therapist or your partner or a friend says, well, hang on a minute, actually, is there something you could have done differently there? And of course, it's not what you want to hear, is it? What you want to hear is
right,
for you. You've been completely
right.
outdone by. But what is
Well,
therapy based on? Therapy is based on the idea that the only thing in the room that we can control, that we can adapt, that we can work on, is the client's way of being in the world. It's it's
right,
it's how the clients do
right.
it.
So yeah, that's the corrosive effect that this ideology has, I think, on psychotherapy, because then the therapist becomes the person says, "Oh no, no, you're fine. It's not your fault." We can say that it's all these other forces, and it doesn't relocate the locus of control.
Mm,
With the
mm.
person,
It's a great
and I
big illusion, really. You and I would have been taught that that was the wrong thing to do. But, my concern is I don't want to really go into detail about why, but I am aware from contacts in being trained now that there's a lot more of an emphasis upon oppression, on kind of sociological issues. Well, like
mhm,
if you want to go and do a training in sociology, if you want to go and become a sociologist, go and do a degree in
mhm,
sociology. But what we're
right,
seeing is the replacement of theories of change. Really, what is psychotherapy? It's a big compendium of theories of why things happen the
right,
way they do in the psyche and how you can change it, right? And
mhm, mhm,
different people like different ones, and we all come to different syntheses, and
mhm,
and that's fine. It's like we're not threatened by heterodoxy. We're not threatened by difference. You
mhm,
don't
mhm.
you don't have to see the human condition and how to do psychotherapy in exactly the same way that I do. And in fact, it strengthens the field that there are different emphases.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But now the idea is everything is sort of being reduced to a sort of I want to be I don't want to kind of make things too sort of black and white, but there's a lot more discussion, I think, about sociological and political issues, which are only, in my view, tangentially relevant to
Okay. Well, maybe there's a segue here to play the devil's advocate, maybe for both of us right now,
Hmm.
because this is something I've been thinking about in anticipating talking with you. Um, so everything that both of us have just said, we believe is true. At the same time, is there not injustice in the world? Are there not people who are victimized by bad treatment? Is
Mhm.
there any danger that what we're saying will pave that over and make it something that becomes taboo to acknowledge?
Of course, there is that danger because it is it seems to be something in the nature of the human psyche that we tend to like binaries. we tend to like to flee uh to sort of splits between sort of completely different categories. So
Yeah,
you're absolutely right to point that out, and I think that sort of needs to be pointed out on a regular basis because um, not necessarily in every moment that we're talking about this, because the critique that we have, I think, is a legitimate one. But you can critique our critique, if that makes sense.
right.
And I think perhaps I hope sort of unlike um, sort of many of the people who are using critical social justice ideology as a sort of a psychic balm or a psychic crutch, I'm quite reticent about being critiqued. And if somebody says, "Well, hang on, you're not mentioning this. Have you not thought about that?" I'm quite happy to say, "No, you're correct. I haven't mentioned that. I have
Right,
thought about it, but it's not the focus and thrust
right,
of the statement. But are you right to point that out? Yes, you are." So
right.
that younger version of me is not completely wrong. You know, I don't
Uh-huh.
completely sort
Right,
of
right, right,
repudiate
right, right. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
early.
Yeah. And my way of thinking about this clinically is that in the practice with a particular individual, if they say something that suggests they have been the victim of some form of oppression and that they have some awareness of it or inkling, that it's fair game to talk about it and to
Mhm.
see how they experienced it, what the circumstances were, kind of understand it as well as possible. And then, to me, the way forward is not to reinforce a victim mentality, or some kind of ideological frame around the world, but to say, okay, what do you want to do about this? You know,
Mm. So
how
you're
can you manage this? How can you combat it? Do you want to become a social justice activist? That's an option. You could, you know, uh, but if that doesn't serve your life mission and your forward motion in what you want your life to look like, then maybe it's not the thing for you.
I
What do you think
agree
of
with
that?
you.
What do you? Is that a reasonable way to approach it? Do you think?
I think it is. And I mean, you know, the point one of the points to be made here is that I regard whatever my own politics are, and frankly, they're quite heterodox, really. You know, it's like some days I feel like a dyed-in-the-wool reactionary. Some days I'm getting more in touch with my sort of social democratic heritage. Sometimes I feel like a classical little. It's kind of it sort of depends on
Mm-hmm.
life is not
Mm-hmm. You're,
reducible.
you're you're non-binary, huh?
Absolutely, I am not. I'm ideologically non-binary because life is not reducible to any one ideology. I think, and everything
Mm-hmm.
is
Mm-hmm.
kind of a balancing of competing goods. I think so.
Mm-hmm.
You know, freedom is an important good, but so is equality. There's a kind of there's a sort of there's always a kind of balance being struck. But I like your clinical suggestion there. And it puts me in mind of a client I don't work with anymore. I used to work with some time ago, who was very into this ideology. And
Mm-hmm.
what uh, what I did with her was I didn't disrespect the way she'd sort of structured the world. I sort of made it clear to her I wasn't trying to change her politics. I sort of said that
Mm-hmm.
I'm not here to change your philosophy, your politics. What I said I was there to do was to help her mentalize different possibilities. So, for instance, I would say when somebody comes and says something bad has happened to me, I'm a victim of oppression or discrimination, say that might well be the case because racism exists and sexism exists,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Mm-hmm.
consciously and unconsciously. Um, but I think the first thing you want to do with somebody is to help them rather than leap to a conclusion that an event A is a consequence of condition B. Say, what you want to do is to say, okay, we've got event A. could be condition B, could be condition C, could be condition D. So there's something about Fonagy's idea of sort of mentalization, of sort of having different, being able to mentalize different people's psyches as
Uh-huh.
potentially there being different options in relation to what's going on in them, different theories of case, I think.
Right. Yeah, yeah. It's a
Right.
it's also I think related to CBT in a way, and
Mm.
I don't think the idea is to see if the person can't come up with a better cognitive frame, but more importantly, whether they can develop the capacity to imagine multiple frames and begin
Mm.
to evaluate them, you know. I think
I agree.
that's the thing, not, the better frame. Yeah.
But yes, there is no, and I agree, there is no one correct frame. And it's really about, I think for me, it's really about engaging, getting into the space of being flexible. I think that, that's how I think about it.
Right.
And you might well conclude that something might probably was discriminatory or was what is a function of oppression. And then I think, as you say, well, it's about kind of, obviously you want to mourn the experience, but then it's about helping somebody think about agency. Well, is there something you can do about this or not? And of
hmm
course, we can't change society, but what we can change is how we operate within society. How does one
Right.
defend oneself against other people's
Right.
projections? Which is what I
Right.
think. I think racism is in many ways. It's
Right.
different things. Obviously, racism is sort of, it's partly a system that exists to justify different types of sort of economic privilege for different people, but it's also psychological, right? It's a projection of the negative to the
Sure.
other. So
Yeah,
it's a
it's
discriminatory.
one version of, in-group loyalty,
Mm.
in-group, out-group, which is just something we're saddled with evolutionarily. You
Absolutely
just said
so.
something, though, that made me think of this. You said, we're not there to change society, or that's not our job. But apparently, that is our new job. We're
So we're
supposed to
told.
recruit people for that task.
Yeah, it's well, I didn't sign. I'll tell you what, I've done my political activism. I did it when I was younger. I would sort of go out delivering leaflets for the Labour Party. And I've done that, thanks. Political activism is not in my present or my future, so you can count me out. Uh,
Uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh,
what I'm interested in doing now is helping people work out how to live nourishing, fulfilling lives, which is
uh-huh.
the same thing as political activism, in my view. Uh, it's a
hmm
kind of you can sit there and you can listen to somebody's problems and you can say, "Oh, well, yes, that's all a function of a dark, oppressive world." But then, what are you going to do with that? You could say that, right? But what are you going
Exactly.
to do
Yeah.
with
What are you going to do with that? Yeah. How does that serve
it?
your life? Yeah.
Because the other point I want to make is that the world always, in some senses, you can always see both angles, right? The world always has been darkly oppressive in some way or another, and it always will be. There
hmm
is no change in human nature. That doesn't mean that's all there is. There's also compassion and love and solidarity and
Uh-huh.
play, and there's
Well, yeah.
but the dark
And
stuff.
for all of the accusations and all of the condemnations that fall on Western culture and Western civilization, we've made some progress, have we not? I mean, have we not, made a dent in this dark darkness that is human nature? I mean,
I would say that in terms of, well, have we? Maybe. I don't know. I think materially, Western.
really, you don't think coming out of
I think
slavery was a good thing?
yeah, it was. Of course, it was a good thing, but I think history repeats in rhymes. So
hmm
I think what would I say? I mean, I would say that without myself as a being broadly pro Western here, which I realize is a terrible thing to do, but I think the combination of sort of liberal politics and managed markets, sort of capitalism with with some sort of state direction, that seems to have been a great way to develop human flourishing. Really, it seems to be good for kind of
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
our
So there's still
material.
disparity between the haves and the have-nots, but the kind of baseline level of poverty has raised quite
Absolutely.
significantly. Yeah.
And I think it's also important to realize that in a free society, in a society where you allow people to take responsibility for their own decisions and then gain the fruits or the disappointments of that, there always is going to be some disparity. But then the debate is, of
Right.
course, about how much disparity and how do you assist others and so forth.
Right.
But is there moral improvement? I think it's an interesting question. I think one view might be, I suppose, that we're constantly sort of increasing our kind of moral realm, so we sort of expand it to include more and more people, and then perhaps beyond people into other beings as well. Um, Maybe we do, but I also find myself thinking that, um, well, the woke are obsessed by the historic slavery, the wrongs of Western countries, although
Uh-huh.
they they seem to be very interested in history, but they don't seem to be very interested in British history. Because, of course, Britain pretty much single-handedly stamped out
Right.
the Atlantic slave trade and spent
Right.
a
Right.
few percent of its
Nor are
GDP on
they
doing.
nor are they much interested in world history or the tradition of slavery that pretty much spans all cultures through time.
Absolutely right. I mean,
Yeah.
why were there slaves available for European merchants to purchase
Well,
on the
yeah.
coast of West Africa? Is
They
because the
were they
states
were
in West Africa
hmm
were practicing slavery. They didn't exist
hmm
otherwise.
hmm hmm
These are things that apparently it's a faux pas to say these things now. It's sort of rude to actually recognize the fullness
Right.
of the history. We're meant to sit there and engage in a mea culpa. Well, again, when I was younger, I spent a lot of time feeling guilty about being middle class and white and male, and I've
hmm
had enough of
hmm
it, to be honest, Michael. I've made my own accommodation with it, and I don't particularly intend to go back into that dynamic. I think it's in my past, and I would
Right.
encourage other white straight men
Yeah.
to come to their own acceptance of themselves as well. Just as I would also say the same to a uh, a, a, a black lesbian, say, for instance. Wouldn't it be good if we could all find a way not to be overly hung up in a negative way about our identities? Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing?
Sure, wouldn't it? And wouldn't it be good if our sense of well-being and self-worth weren't so easily disrupted by some idiot's insensitive comment?
Well, absolutely, because life's going to have insensitive comments, so
Yeah.
we need to be able to go. I mean, goodness me, I mean, we all in life. Nothing I say in the chapter that in life we both intentionally and unintentionally give and receive harms. So the sometimes you feel really angry with somebody and you want to upset them, right?
hmm hmm
Sometimes you just say something that's ill-considered. You haven't thought about it, and it upsets somebody else.
hmm
The point is, we're always exchanging these sort of disappointments,
hmm
if you like,
Yeah,
and we need to get used to that because that's part of life.
right.
Um,
Have you read Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's book, The Coddling of the American Mind?
I have, yes,
Yeah,
yes. It's great.
I'm
It's
just
great.
reminded, I'm currently just about to finish that, and they make a great argument for not being overly sensitive to these things and developing resilience by, accepting that some degree of this is going to happen. And the
Well,
fact that by protecting people, children, and then young adults from any such experiences, we don't help them. We just make them not resilient.
this is the why do we have fairy tales, right? We have fairy
Right,
tales
exactly.
because they're teaching us when we're children that life is not a bed of roses. Actually, it can
Right.
be. You got to watch out for yourself. It can be a bit
Yeah,
dark, but with the right attitude, with the right approach, you're going to be okay.
right.
That's the point of a fairy tale, right? And so today we're sort of we're doing the opposite. We're strenuously trying to coddle not just children, but adults. Of course, we're fundamentally, what's happening, I think, culture-wide, certainly in the Anglophone countries, is that we are infantilizing adults. We are telling them that they are incapable of dealing with an unkind word. We are
Hmm.
telling them that they are fragile, that they are vulnerable, and that they are going to collapse if they are not protected.
Hmm.
The, this is absolutely the wrong thing we should be teaching people. We should be teaching people
Hmm.
that they can develop resilience. And then, of
Yeah.
course, yes, of course, they are vulnerable. We're all vulnerable sometimes, but you can be vulnerable. You can get hurt, and you can recover. You can come back.
Hmm.
Um, but what we're sort of teaching people is that it's a disaster. It's a disaster to be upset. It's a disaster to be rejected. It's a
Right.
disaster to be
Yeah.
mistreated.
Well,
It's
yeah. And when I think of my own childhood, there were times when people, other boys attempted to bully me, and my memory of standing up for myself, fighting back, uh, they're precious memories to me.
I
It
can well
gave me an
imagine.
internal sense that I don't have to collapse. I can stand up for myself.
What a great example! What a great example! Because
Yeah.
that's why, traditionally the idea was, wasn't it, that traditionally the idea was if you're being, nobody wants anybody to be bullied, right? But if you were being bullied at school, you might go to a parent, and the parent might say, "Okay, I will intervene if I need to, so don't worry, you're going to be fine. But if you can push back yourself first,
Hmm.
have,
Hmm.
have a go."
Right.
Because that's how we develop resilience. It's
Right.
not it's not a cruelty to try and let someone do something for themselves.
No, it's compassion.
It is
Really.
compassion.
I mean, yeah,
Yeah, I agree with you, and I can
yeah,
well imagine that I can well imagine those memories are kind of I can well imagine that they're cherished actually because
yeah. Well, yeah,
that's how we learn. That's how we learn,
yeah.
right?
Well, if I was to replace those memories with something else, like I just, you know, fell into a puddle of tears and ran away and tried to hide from these guys, if that was what I remembered, I think I'd be a different person.
Yes, it's well, it's inarguable, isn't it? You
Yeah.
would have a different sense of yourself. You would engage. You would relate differently to other
Hmm.
people. Um, you'd be
Hmm.
you certainly wouldn't be doing what you're doing with this podcast.
Probably not. Probably not. Yeah. And, in some odd way, I suppose this is kind of odd, but it's possible to appreciate or to be grateful for these bullies. They provided something that I needed.
I agree. I think
Yeah. And I've
we're getting into
sometimes
the
wondered
territory of sort of I always think
if
kind of
that's
how is it?
I'm sorry, I interrupt. Go ahead. What did you say?
No, you carry on. You carry
Well,
I was
I've
just saying we're getting
sometimes
into
wondered
the territory of
whether evolution has provided us with bullies, whether that's what a bully's for. You know, it's not like
Taoism.
we should try to make there not be any bullies at all. It's like there's something that they provide to a point,
I remember reading
to a point.
to a point. You don't want to kind of if you can stop egregious bad
Right.
behavior, then that's a good thing to do. But to a point, one has to allow a bit of misbehavior, I think, in the playground. Say, I mean, I'm reminded of an article that I read a couple of years ago about goings on in a primary school where uh, the children were told that they should not talk about having best friends because to have a best friend was exclusionary, and it excludes other children. And I remember reading this, and it was probably in the Daily Mail or something. So who knows how accurate it was. But I remember thinking there were some follow-up stories actually. But I think I remember thinking at the time that actually this there probably was something in it. But actually, we need to both. reject and be rejected, because otherwise life has no meaning. Because if you can't reject, you can't have a best friend. You can't have a wife or a husband. You can't have things you genuinely love. If you are truly indifferent to everything, to all
Right,
people, all ideas, all
right,
places, all, whatever it is,
right,
religions,
right.
ideas.
Neither does antisocial behavior receive any consequence.
Absolutely right, because you must accept. Yes, you must
Right.
you must accept the thing that is that you dislike, including the antisocial.
Yeah.
You can't be intolerant of the thing that is causing damage.
Right.
We must all be equally accepting of everything. And I fear that's the place we've ended up with in our society. I feel there's something a little bit psychotic almost about it, actually, that just as the psychotics sometimes find it
Hmm.
difficult to make the distinction between the internal and the external. What's inside me, what's outside there, where's the boundary. So
Hmm.
I sort of we're having this problem in terms of this idea of being sort of perfectly accepting of everything, of all behaviors, um, of all people, of all ideas, and so on and so forth. It's a kind of it's there is something a little psychotic about it. This trouble we're having with borders as well. This idea if you have a border, you can't enforce it. You should just allow anybody across the border. Well,
Right.
again, there's something about what's in and what's out. There's Our societies are being sort of
Hmm.
turned a bit mad, I think, by the idea that
Right.
you can engage in no discrimination between A and B. It's very interesting.
Yeah. And if you have an opinion about the need for strong borders, then you're a racist and a xenophobe, and
And
you're a
I,
bad person.
you're a very bad person, and there's no interesting discussion to be had and to see where points you might agree or points you might disagree.
Right.
You're just a very bad person.
Yeah.
And I hear of apparently people are saying in trainings these days, oh, I'd find it very hard to work with a conservative. Oh, I'd find it very hard to work with a racist. Not that those two things are the same thing, but the idea is they're the same thing. Oh, I'd find it very
Mm-hmm.
hard to work with
A Trump
uh,
supporter.
Trump supporter or whatever, as it would be in
Yeah. Yeah.
America. And it's kind of well, that's half the country to start with. So, if you don't want to work with half the country, I don't think I can say very much about your interest in diversity. It
Right.
doesn't seem
Right.
very if you're it
Right.
doesn't seem
Yeah.
very
It's
very kind of
not
committed.
not diverse. Yeah.
But it's a kind of I mean, I've worked with all sorts of people, and I'm sure you have as well. I've worked with people
Oh,
who
sure.
self-identify as being communists. I work with people who self-identify as critical theorists. I've worked with
Hmm.
people who
Hmm.
are extremely right-wing. I remember, I haven't done it recently, but I remember working with somebody who actually identified himself as an ideological racist. I've worked with all sorts of people.
Hmm.
Point is, my job is never to tell them that they're morally wrong or morally right. My job is to help them think about why they might. Part of my job is to help them think about why they might occupy the position that they occupy. Uh,
Uh-huh. Sure.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
the racist chap I worked with was less ideologically racist by the time he'd finished working with me than he was at the beginning. But
Uh-huh.
I'm pretty certain he would not have responded well if I just told him he was a terrible human being.
Right.
Uh,
Uh-huh.
some of- what my sort of the client I was referring to earlier, who was very woke, what I said to her in the end was, look, it seems to be making you unhappy because it seems to make you feel like you don't fit into society. But this is existence. If you feel that you can get a benefit from promoting this ideology and you might be able to kind of get something out of it, why not do it? Right? It's like
Hmm.
none of this is I always think that the morality of psychotherapy is not about saying what's right and what's wrong. It's in the frame. It's about how you treat the client. It's not about how you agree with or disagree with
Hmm.
the client's ideas.
Hmm.
We're all in the long run, we're all dead. Everybody's got to make a choice
Right.
about
Right.
how they want to occupy the
And
world in the meantime.
and part of what I think can happen within the frame of psychotherapy is what I'd call a cost benefit analysis of whatever position one takes. Like you
Mm.
said, what do you get out of it? Okay. All right, I can understand why you're doing it.
Mm.
Do you perceive any costs? You know,
And then you make your choices, right? You
right,
balance your conflicts.
right,
The psychodynamic conflict, I think, is a fundamental part of life, that we're pulled in different directions. Every good comes with a bad, every bad comes with a good. Only the
right,
individual can weigh these things up for themselves.
right. It's trade-offs all the
It
way.
is it's
Yeah,
trade-offs all the way down, I think, isn't it? And that's what's being lost in the kind of the headlong rush into kind of ideological and moral certainty, the idea that we're there to kind of preach a particular gospel,
right.
is that
I
we're
agree.
losing sight of the reality, this
Hmm.
this underlying reality, that actually everything is trade-offs. The suffering is inevitable. Yes, maybe you can reduce it. Hopefully you can over time, but it's still inevitable.
Right.
you know these are truths of existence. These are not political points. For me to say this, for you to say this, it doesn't make us right wing, quote unquote. This is just a sort of a recognition of
It's,
reality.
yeah, I agree. I agree. And if that isn't recognized, and there's a utopian vision for how to answer all of suffering by imposing such and such frame on all of society, what's the cost? We've seen that, as you suggested earlier, in the last century. What happens? Uh, it doesn't go
Struggle,
well.
tension,
Yeah,
persecution. Ultimately, if
gulags.
if
Yeah,
you leave it long enough and it goes far enough, you end up with ideological killings. Ultimately,
right. Yeah.
where I think we're a way off that, but that's another question. Am I paranoid? I think that's a good question to ask yourself. Because if you can ask yourself if you're paranoid, well, you're not paranoid, because paranoid people don't tend to ask themselves. But
Right.
but I do ask myself that question,
Well, yeah. Are
because I
we
do I
are
do
we
perceive us heading in a bad way.
have we slipped down into some rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and somehow we're deluded? I don't know. I mean, I think it's premature to say that that's definitely where we're going, but when we look at history and we look at what's happening now, I think we can see some patterns. And another author in critical or in cynical therapies, Kirsty Miller, who I hope to have as a guest as well, talks about what is the 5 steps to genocide, really,
Mm,
and we're treading that path,
mm.
and it's demonstrated through history. And they say, if you don't learn your history, you're doomed to repeat it, and if you do, you're doomed to watch everybody else repeat
It's a great quote,
it.
because it's so true, isn't it? And I think we have to kind of, one has to deal with one's own frustrations about that. I think, doesn't one?
Mhm.
It's that actually, I think these cycles seem to be, there's something in the human psyche that needs to be able to split, that needs an expression of viciousness, that needs to make things
Mhm.
simple, needs to get the sadism out. Uh, there's, it's in my mind, it's hard to look at human nature and conclude that it's good. I think it's pretty mixed. I think it's got good parts, but unfortunately, of course, what happens is, when we go through these cycles, there's a lot of harm, there's a lot of damage that happens, and I guess it's, maybe this is a kind of an appeal to your listeners, your watchers, that actually,
Mhm.
if you do perceive us as sort of going through a kind of some kind of negative cycle at the moment, maybe it's about thinking about what can you preserve. What can you preserve in your own life, in your own sphere, in your own area,
Mhm. Mhm.
so that it's there to come back to later? Because I think that's a question
Uh,
for us psychotherapists. What can we look
great.
after?
Okay. Yeah, yeah. That's excellent. I'm looking at the time. I think probably we should wrap up soon, but I think this is a good concluding note, perhaps. In your chapter, the last paragraph or so seems to take that turn and suggest a way forward like this. And I was thinking of the Solzhenitsyn quote, which I can't say exactly, but it has to do with, where is the line that defines good from evil? It runs through every human heart. And I think that means that that's all of us. That's you, that's me, that's everybody. And we have to recognize our own shadow and take responsibility for it. And as you suggested earlier, have some kind of vision for our life, some form of meaning that we can pursue. Uh,
Absolutely. I think
yeah.
meaning solves a lot of the pain. And I would also
Hmm.
say, circling back around to where we began, I think that meaning helps solve a lot of the viciousness that we all, the rage, the frustration that we feel at life. If you can find a meaning for your life and you
Hmm.
can pursue it, I think it's a way to actually neutralize some of these more difficult kind of ways of being that we're talking about. Actually, this sort of the viciousness, the sadistic tendencies, the desire to dominate and manipulate, and so on and so forth. If you can find some meaning, I think some of those other desires can become less sort of insistent. Actually, that's certainly been my experience in my life.
Hmm.
Uh,
Okay. I would say the same. So, yeah. Well, thank you. I think that's a good note to end on.
there's
Uh,
always a hint of optimism, right?
yeah, why not?
I
Why not?
agree. Well, yeah.
Not not naive optimism, but optimism nevertheless.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. And I hope we'll stay in touch. Yeah.
Absolutely. Look
Okay.
forward to
So
speaking
long.
soon.